Do you want me to start, or do you have some things you want to say about ReachForce?
No. You can do the OCI thing in a second.
Okay.
So let's kick off. My name is Brian Vanderwerf. This is Rob View. We run the Groovy Grails user group here. Thanks for coming out. I'm trying to think of any kind of news coming up, any big events. GGX is in December. Is that the next conference?
Grails Exchange is in December in London, yeah.
Awesome.
Yep.
So look forward to seeing what new fun stuff comes out of that. I think there's call for papers open if any of you want to speak at conferences for Greach and GreatConf EU. So if you look on their Twitter, you can, if you have a good idea you want to do for a talk, try it out.
Greach is in Madrid, right?
Yeah, yep. Madrid. And GreatConf EU is in Copenhagen, in Denmark. Very cool places to go. Worth doing.
What is that?
Anybody know any conferences or anything going on here locally?
Any other they would like to promote in the U.S. or any big announcements that are going on? I know Gradle's chugging along with the new versions, and is Grails 3.1's not out yet? Still milestone?
Yeah, Grails 3.1 is not out yet, but will be by the end of the year.
Sweet. Forward to it. All right, well, without further ado, we'll have Jeff Brown come up and say a few words about OCI, who's been gracious to sponsor, pay for the food and drinks tonight.
Yep. Yeah, very good. Yeah, so I'm Jeff Brown. I'm on the core Grails development team, and so this meeting was a last minute. I forgot to turn this thing. Oh, it is on, isn't it? Is that on? Yeah. Well, this meeting was a last-minute commitment. So just in the last week or so, I committed to. I'm in the Austin area to meet with a client, and Ryan saw on my TripIt or through some social media channel, he noticed I was going to be in Austin and said, "Hey, can you come talk at the user group?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd be happy to do that." And I said, what would you like for me to talk about? And he said, "I don't care. Talk about something Grails related." He said, "Testing," or I said, "Okay, that's good enough. I'll just talk about testing." And literally last night, and I've got a little bit of support to back this up. 17 hours ago would have been, what time is it right now? So 17 hours ago would have been 2 o'clock this morning. You can see it was the last commit for this. This I did it at shortly after lunch today. This is a minor commit. But at 2 o'clock this morning is when I finished writing the slides for this presentation. This was completely a last-minute organizational thing, but I'm confident that we can make it interesting. So I'm going to talk about just a number of testing-related things that Grails provides, but I'm happy to talk about anything at all Groovy and Grails related, so we can work through this. And if you've got questions about stuff that's not testing related, anything at all about Groovy or Grails, I'd be happy to talk about that. Thanks to Ryan and ReachForce for hosting the thing. This is fantastic. Just a little bit about OCI. OCI is Object Computing. We're based in St. Louis, Missouri. I joined OCI in 1997, so quite a long time ago. When Groovy and Grails were first emerging, we formed a company called G21, and at that point, I took kind of a hiatus from OCI to invest in the technology and get it work towards getting it enterprise ready. And so we spent about a year and a half working on the technology at G21, and SpringSource acquired G21 at that point. So the Groovy and the Grails technology and the teams became part of SpringSource, and we were really excited about that. Kind of the rest of the long story short is VMware acquired SpringSource, so we became part of VMware, and then a few years ago Pivotal spun out of VMware, and we were part of Pivotal, and earlier this year we left Pivotal. And when we left Pivotal, or announced we were leaving Pivotal, we talked to a whole bunch of organizations who were interested in having us and the technology come on board. And OCI was one of them. And after a few conversations, it didn't really take us a long time to figure out that OCI was going to be a fantastic place to go. We decided to join OCI. So the Grails team and the technology are all at OCI now. OCI provides professional services around the technology, so that includes training, support, consulting, professional services all around the technology. We're having just a great success with the technology at OCI. It's great to be at an organization that's really 100% behind the technology and fully supportive of where we want to head with it. The framework is still under the same technical leadership it has always been. So things are going great at OCI. If you need any kind of professional support around the framework, give us a call and let me know. We'd be happy to talk to you about that. And with that, we'll get right into the tech stuff. So I'm just going to run through some testing scenarios that Grails supports and provide kind of a sense for some of the testing possibilities that the framework has to offer. And to do that, I'm just going to step through a few examples of some things we can do to test domain classes, test command objects in controllers, test tag libraries, kind of an interesting way to test REST APIs, and then talk a little bit about just running tests and what that looks like in Grails 3 as opposed to Grails 2 and why Grails 3 is, I'll talk about some interesting things around running tests that relates to Grails 3. So first I'll talk about testing domain classes. So if we've got a simple domain class like this, and rich domain models versus lean domain models is a thing that people like to debate about. Grails will allow you to have a rich domain model or a lean domain model. This is an example, of course, of a lean domain model. There's no logic in the domain class, and my own personal preference is that makes sense to me. That's the way that I like to write domain classes. So there's really not logic in this class to test. But I might want to test the constraints that I express. So I've got a ridiculously simple constraint expressed here, just so we've got something to run some tests against. But that's a domain class, and the only thing that I might want to test here is that the constraints are behaving the way that I like. So I could have a simple Spock test that does that. And there's a number of interesting things even in this simple test to talk about. So one, the test is annotated with @test4person, and the test4 annotation is provided by the Grails framework. And when you annotate a test in Grails with test4, you have to specify the class that this test is a test for. So in this case, the class is the person class, and Grails will recognize that person is a domain class, and because of that, a number of interesting things happen to this test. And there are fewer interesting things that happen to a test for a domain class and more interesting things that happen to a test for other artifact types, and we'll see some of that coming up. So this is a test for the person class, and I'll come back to this unroll business in just a moment. Let's do some hand waving over that and talk about the rest of the test, and then I'll circle back around and talk about unroll. So this test has one expectation. It expects that when I create a person and initialize the age property with person age, whatever value that is, which we'll get to in a minute. So I create a person and initialize the age property with some value, and then validate the object. I expect validate to return whatever should be valid is equal to. So I'm creating a person, calling validate, and then making an assertion about what that returns. Notice that when I call validate, normally in a Grails application, when you validate an object, you'll call validate and not pass any arguments. And in this case, I'm passing a list of strings. There's only one string in this case, but it's a list of strings. And when you pass a list of strings as an argument to the validate method, that causes the validator to only validate the properties that are present in that list. And the reason that I want to do that here is there are other properties in the class. I went the wrong way. There we go. There are other properties in this class. There's a first name and a last name property, and it's common for, of course, it's common for a domain class to have lots of properties. And I might want to test the validator for just one property. If I validate everything and I haven't initialized the first name and the last name property, the validation is going to fail because first name and last name are null, and all of your persistent properties are not nullable by default. So the test could be made a little bit more tedious, and I could initialize first name and last name. But the bigger this domain class is, the more tedious that would get. I don't want to have to care about any of the other properties. I want to validate just the age property and assert that it validates or doesn't validate under certain conditions. So this is a common use case for calling validate and passing a list of strings. I only want to validate certain properties, and I don't want to have to monkey with the rest of the properties in this domain class or potentially graphs of objects. I want to just initialize the age property and test its validation. So that's passing a list of strings to the validate method is a simple way to do that. So there are two variables on that line, person age and should be valid. So those need to have some value for this test to make sense. So if we jump down to the where block, this is all Spock behavior that I'm describing from this point. So under the where block, you can think of that as as a table. And in this case, the table has 2 columns, but I can have as many columns as I like. And the way this works is the column names are separated by vertical bars. The first row, where you see person, age, and should be valid, represent sort of the column headings for this table. Those headings represent variable names that Spock will create. And what will happen is for every row in this table, the test will be run. So new person.validate age equals should be valid is going to be executed over and over and over again, once for every row in that table. The first time the test is run, person age will be equal to -2, and should be valid will be equal to false. So the first time the test runs, I'm asserting that -1 is in fact an invalid. It's not a valid age. So -2 should be false. I think I said -1 a minute ago. -2 should be false. -1 should be false. 0 and 1 should be true. 119 and 120 should be true. And 121 and 122 should be false. So I'm expressing that the age must be between 0 and 120, and then I've got a couple of values at either end of the range there to make sure that those are not valid. So this test gets run over and over again, 8 or 9 times, however many elements are in that table. And each time, person age has a different value, and should be valid potentially has a different value. So it's false 4 times and true 4 or 5 times. So I don't have to write a loop in my test. I define this table, and it's kind of a data table that is the data that gets fed into the test. So as many rows as I've got in that table, that's how many different tests are actually being run here. So if I circle back around to the unroll annotation, again, this is a Spock behavior. I can annotate a test method with @unroll, and notice in that string that's passed to the unroll annotation, there are a couple of variables. There's pound person age, and at the end is pound should be valid. So what will happen is it will be as if there were 8 different test methods in this test class, and the test methods will be something like validate on a person with age -2 should have returned false, right? So the variable substitution takes place where you see those pound person age and pound should be validate. So now when I run the tests in my IDE, I'll see 8 different test methods, and the test method describes not generally what's being tested. The test method describes specifically what values are being tested. So that's useful. When one of them fails, I'll see that the test method says validate on a person with age 0 should have returned false or should have returned true, and it didn't. So the unroll annotation is a really slick way to deal with tests like this. So the test method name itself has the values being tested in the method name, which is just really nice. All that makes sense? Yep. Any questions about any of that? That's all cool stuff. Let's see. Next, we'll talk about testing controllers, not tag libraries. So here I've got a simple controller that has an index action that doesn't do anything, and the interesting action here is called create widget, and the create widget method accepts a widget parameter and simply puts the widget parameter in a map that's returned. So I can make some assertions about, in my test, I'm going to make some assertions about the state of that widget. Notice that the widget has a width and a height parameter, a width and a height property, and a name property, and width and height are each initialized to have a minimum value of 1. So a widget describes some kind of physical thing, and a physical thing can't have a width or a height that's less than 1. That's our rules. So I've got a controller that does some stuff and returns a model is all that's really important there. I keep going the wrong way. So here's a unit test for testing that, and this is something that often Grails developers, a common thing that Grails developers will do is they'll create an instance of the widget class and pass that as an argument to the create widget method, and that makes sense, right? Because the create widget method here accepts a widget parameter, but for most cases that's really not the best way to test this. A better way to test this is not to pass a widget object as an argument to create widget, but to let your test do something that's more consistent with what the real application does. In the real application, the way that command objects work is because there is a width and a height and a name property in the widget class, when a request comes into to this controller and the request is bound for the create widget action, the framework will recognize that the create widget action accepts a widget parameter. So what the framework's going to do with that is it's going to create a new instance of the widget class, it's going to subject the widget to data binding. So if there's a width request parameter, its value will be bound to the width property, and if there's a height request parameter, its value will be bound to the height property, and so forth. So the framework will create a widget, subject it to data binding, then subject it to dependency injection, then validate it, and then call your controller action. So all that stuff happens before your controller action ever gets executed. And it makes sense for the unit test to simulate that same process. So in the unit test, what I'm doing is I'm assigning some values to params.width, params.height, and params.name. So I'm simulating request parameters coming into the application. And then I'm invoking the create widget method and not passing any object as an argument. I'm passing no arguments when I invoke the create widget method here. And that looks like it would probably be invalid, right? Because there is no version of the create widget method in this class that doesn't accept a parameter. But at compile time, what the framework does is it will create a create widget method in your controller that accepts no parameters. And the code inside of that method does all the stuff I just described. It creates the widget, data binding, subjects it to data binding, and then dependency. All that stuff that I described earlier is in the version of create widget that accepts no arguments that the compiler has generated for you. So this test is calling that method, and that makes sense because that's what really happens at runtime when a request comes into the create widget action. So that makes sense to me. So the first things that happen inside the when block here is we're initializing some request parameters. Then we call the create widget method. The create widget method returns a model. So we're holding on to that in a local variable here that I just called model. And then I'm retrieving the widget from the model. So I've set up the request parameters, invoked the action, got some stuff back, and now I want to make some claims about the thing that I got back. Yeah?
What if you have two models?
What if you have two domain classes? Two command objects? The same thing would happen here. So if those two command objects each had a width parameter, width property, then the width parameter would be bound to both of them. Most often what you want to do is have one command object. And if that command object needs, so let's say you've got a widget and you've also got some other command object, a price class, and inside the price class is some other properties. Instead of having two command objects, I'd have one command object that had a reference to each of those things, and the data binding mechanism is quite sophisticated. So what will happen, and this is going to be hard to follow without some code, so let me jump into the IDE here and describe this. What is that? That's the demo controller. So let's say we had a class like this. Whatever, that doesn't really make sense. But so I've got two different properties inside the price class, and I've got three properties in the widget class. So I might have some other command. So we'd want to give that a real name. But price, and widget W, and then up here I would have this accept one of those. Right now, if there's a request parameter called price.value. So price refers to this. Price.value will refer to that. If there's a request parameter called price.value, the framework will create the whole graph of objects. It'll navigate as far down the dotted path as is necessary, and will bind price.value to whatever's at the tip of that. So you end up with just one command object, and it can reference all the stuff that it needs to reference. Does that make sense? Yep, it is very cool. The data binding system in Grails is quite sophisticated and does a whole bunch of cool, compelling stuff. Where are we at? I think we're right there. All right. Yeah, go ahead.
So when you created two classes and you were passing those classes, but the parameter we're passing, I suppose that you were not passing them as an object. It was a class name.
Yeah, we're talking about the parameter to the controller action.
Yeah.
This guy right here.
Yeah.
That's right.
So when you created the two classes just now, price and other classes.
Right.
So when you're passing that, it has to be the reference has to be a superclass of those two classes. No.
It does not. So let me just undo what I just undid, and we'll clarify that maybe. So if I do that, some other command is not a subclass of anything interesting here, right? It's a subclass of java.lang.object. That's perfectly valid. So there's no inheritance relationship between widget price and some other command other than they all extend from java.lang.object.
No, but the price, if you want to pass the class price into the...
Up here?
Yeah.
Yep. So
then you have to change that.
well, so you get to express what type of thing you want passed in.
I got I thought that is kind of something that we interface. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, no interface.
Okay.
Yeah, you get to express what type of object will be passed into the controller action there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mine's silliness. Okay.
No, it's not silliness at all. Yeah, so I could initialize the parameters with like params.with. I can create a whole dotted path that represents a complicated graph of objects. That whole graph will be created before any of your controller code is ever executed. All right, so in the when block, quickly review. So I'm initializing the request parameters. I'm invoking the controller action. I'm getting the model back, and I'm retrieving the widget from the model. That's the last line in the when block. The then block is where the assertions are being made. So I'm asserting that params.width is equal to 4 and params.height equals 7, and that widget.width equals 4 and widget.height equals 7 and widget.name equals fidget. I could have another test here that asserts that if the request parameter is an invalid value, so if it's less than 1, I can interrogate the command object and verify that it failed validation. But what I want to demonstrate here is passing request parameters or specifying request parameters and then invoking the no argument version of the method is really, I think, the most sensible way to test this method. But that's not obvious to a lot of folks. A lot of folks have written the controller and understand how the controller works and don't realize that they can call a no argument version of that method because it's not apparent from looking at the source code that there is a no argument version of the create widget method. Does that make sense? Yep. So this test, again, is consistent, fairly consistent with what really happens at runtime. And I sort of, so I skipped over this in the first test, but notice in the then block there, we don't see any assertions. We don't see assert equals, or we don't see assert space, we don't see any explicit assertions. And the way assertions work in a Spock test like this is each of those expressions in the then block is just an expression that evaluates to true or false. And if the expression evaluates to true, then that part of the test passes. And if any of those expressions evaluate to false, the test will fail. So you get rid of the assert keyword or calls to assertion-related methods. You just got expressions there that evaluate the true or false. And true expression is good, and a false expression is a failure in your test. Just Spock is a really, really clean way to express unit tests. Not just unit tests, other kinds of tests that we'll see in a little bit. So here's a custom tag library called helper taglib. The default encode as isn't relevant to what I'm going to test. The taglib is in a namespace called demo, and I've got two different tags here. The say hello tag simply pipes a string to the output stream, and the string is parameterized. So it looks like the say hello tag expects there to be a name attribute, and it will use the value of that name attribute in the string that gets piped to the output stream. So say hello, when you invoke say hello, you need to pass in a name as an attribute, and that name will affect the message that's created. And the repeat tag, it looks like the repeat tag accepts or supports a body. So this could be a tag that has stuff in the middle, a tag with a body. And what the repeat tag is doing is retrieving the count attribute. And if there is no count attribute, we're saying the default count will be 3. That's the second argument to adders.int. Adders.int is an interesting method, not specifically related to testing, but it's another thing that a lot of Grails developers are not aware of. So your attributes that come into a tag, and the same with everything I'm about to say about these attributes also applies to request parameters in a controller. But the attributes that come into a custom tag are going to be strings generally. And we want a number, right? So when I invoke the tag, inside of the quotes, I might have the number 4, but that number 4 isn't really the number 4. It's a string that has the number 4 in it, and that's what will be passed into the tag here. But I want to turn that into a number because I'm going to do number stuff with it here in a minute. So one thing I could do is I could retrieve count from adders and then call toInteger on it. right? Groovy allows you to call to-integer on any string, and the string will be converted to an int. And if the string can't be converted to an int, you'll get an exception. A better idea than retrieving the string and invoking to-integer on it is to invoke the int method on the attributes. And there are corresponding methods for all 8 of the primitive types. So there's a Boolean method, a char, a short, a long, a float, a double, int, and whatever the other 2 or 3 that a Boolean. All 8 of the primitive types have corresponding methods here. So if I expected count to be a Boolean, I could call adders.boolean count. Optionally, you can pass a second argument, and that second argument to the int method in this case is a default value. So if there is no count attribute, I want the default value to be 3, right? So after that first line in the repeat tag gets invoked, count will have been initialized either with the number that was passed in or the number 3 if there was no number passed in. And I'm invoking the times method on that number. So that's a Groovyism. That's a simple way to execute a closure some number of times. So the idea is I want to render the body of this tag over and over again. And the number of times that I want to do that is you get to specify that when you invoke this tag, right, with the count attribute. So say hello just pipes a string to out, and the repeat tag is going to render the body of the tag over and over again, and you get to specify the number. So I want to demonstrate how you can test those. So here is a test for the say hello tag. The say hello tag is a simple tag that just generates a string for output. So I've annotated this class with @test4 helper taglib. So the framework at compile time will recognize that helper taglib is a tag library, and it will add some tag library specific stuff to this test. One tag library specific thing that gets added to this test is a method called apply template. And you get to invoke apply template and pass some string as an argument, and that string should be valid GSP code. And what it returns is the result of evaluating that valid GSP code. So in this case, the string that I'm passing to apply template is invoking the say hello tag, which is in the demo namespace, and I'm passing the name Jeff in. The value Jeff is Jeff is the value of the name attribute. So what I expect back is hi there Jeff. And that's consistent with what the tag does, right? The tag is going to render hi there adders.name, and adders.name is going to be Jeff in this example, right? So it's a simple way to unit test a custom GSP tag. Any questions or comments about any of that? No? Go ahead.
Times method, is that a Grails 3 thing, or is that all in 2?
That's a Groovy thing, and that's been in Groovy since pretty much the very beginning. So you can invoke times on any ints and pass a closure as an argument, and the closure will get executed that many times. Yep.
The adders.in call, is that a safe call?
You say, is it a safe call?
Will it handle a, if it's not if the string isn't a number?
Yep. So what you'll get back when you call int, so in this case, what will happen if count is not a number, I'll get back the number 3, not an exception. If I don't pass that optional second argument, I'll get back 0. I'll get back whatever the default value for that type is, and the default value for all the primitives is 0 except for Booleans, and they default to false. But you will not get an exception, and that's one of the benefits of doing this versus adders.count.toInteger. Yep, good question. I sense you might have known the answer to that, and you were offering me the opportunity to point that out, so thank you very much. Any other comments about this test? All right. So I want to test that other tag, the tag that renders the body over and over again. So here's an example of doing that. So this test is calling apply template again and passing or invoking demo : repeat count equals 4, and the body of the tag is the body and then a space. So what I expect to happen is I expect the body of the tag, the literal the space body space, I expect that to be rendered 4 times. And if we scroll over here, we'll see that that is what's being asserted there, and that test does pass. So when you call apply template, what you pass as an argument is anything that would be valid in a GSP, and that code gets evaluated as if it were in a GSP, and what's returned is the result of evaluating that. Make sense? All right. Here is another test for that same tag. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm invoking the repeat tag and not specifying a value for the count. So if we look at the previous test, I'm specifying count equals 4 and then asserting that the body gets rendered 4 times. In this case, what I'm testing is that what happens if I don't specify a value for count. And what I expect to happen is I expect the body to be executed 3 times. And that is, in fact, what's being asserted out here. We got the body, the body, the body. So I'm testing that the repeat tag knows what to do if I don't specify a value for count. Make sense? It's good. Here's another way to test tag libs. So because this test is annotated with test for helper tag lib, the compiler will add a property called taglib to this class, and it'll be what you can do is you can interact with that taglib property, and what taglib will be is it will be associated with the tag library that's being tested. So in this case, the helper taglib. So I can invoke say hello just as if it were a method, and instead of passing attributes like you would to a tag, right back here when I'm invoking the repeat tag, I'm specifying a count attribute. Here, since I'm invoking the tag as a method, I'm passing a map as an argument, name colon Jeffrey, and if there were other attributes, name colon Jeffrey, comma, town colon Austin, comma. So I can pass a map, and the keys in that map will be used as attributes to the tag. So I'm asserting that when I invoke taglib.sayHello and pass Jeffrey as a name, that what I get back is hi there, Jeffrey. So each of these is another way of testing the things that we just saw tested a moment ago. The way to specify the body of a tag when you're testing this way is to pass a closure as the last argument to the tag method invocation, and whatever the closure returns, that's what you're representing the body of the tag would have evaluated to, right? So in both tests, I'm simply returning yes from this closure. So in the first case, I get yes 4 times, and in the last case, I get yes 3 times. Is everything cool there? Mm-hmm. Good. And by the way, so the way that I'm invoking this tag here with taglib.sayHello, from your real application, you can invoke any GSP tags. I want to go back. Remember that this tag is in the demo namespace. So in a controller, I could call demo.repeat or demo.sayHello, and the framework will navigate that to here. So a reason you might do that is it could be that this GSP tag is rendering a template with some text in it or something, and instead of rendering that the GSP tag and making that part of the response, you want to invoke a GSP tag and get back whatever the GSP tag would have generated. So in a controller, if I call demo.sayHello and pass whatever attributes are required, in this case the name, as an argument, instead of that writing to the response, the return value of that method call will be what the tag generated, which is consistent with what's being tested down here. The difference here is here I'm invoking taglib.sayHello, and it'll always be taglib in your unit test. In your real application, instead of taglib.sayHello, you would invoke demo.sayHello, or whatever the namespace of the tag is, .tagname. Make sense? All right. Here's an interesting thing that doesn't relate to Grails testing, but I think is interesting anyway. So here we've got, this is the source code for a tag library. Here is a test, and in a moment I'll flip to the IDE and we'll see there's a real helper taglib spec class. And in that class is this test and this test and this test. All these tests are in the same class. And the way that these slides were generated is using a tool called AsciiDoc. And with AsciiDoc, I can do something like this. Let me look at the test first. Here's the source file, and see there are some special comments in the source file. The tag colon test simple tag. So line 12 is a special comment. Line 17, 19. You see all those comments? Those are there for the benefit of AsciiDoc. And when I render the slides in this case, but I could be doing the exact same thing if I weren't rendering slides, but I were just generating documentation. In the AsciiDoc files, I can refer to these tags, and what will happen is AsciiDoc will reach into your source code and grab whatever's in between those tags and make that part of the documentation. The Groovy user guide uses this approach, and a benefit of that is now you can't have a typo in the documentation. The documentation is pulling code right out of the test or right out of the real code, and the tests pass. These are executable tests in a real Grails project here. So if I were to do something like this, Jeff is in Austin, and I'll just go out here and regenerate my documentation. So I've run Gradle W ASCII doctor is the name of the command I just ran there. It's pretty tiny, but that's what I typed, was Gradle W ASCII doctor. Now I'll open that file back up. Just happen to know the path where it is. We'll wander over here to our tag libs. That's not what I expected. Which test did I change? Let me do that one more time. I didn't do it. No, I didn't. The build that I've got in place here is a little bit hinky. I've got some stuff in build.gradle that doesn't need to be there. What I'm trying to do is whittle down the dependencies. I've got more dependencies than I need in the project right now, and I'm trying to whittle them down. And right now the dirty checking in the build is broken, so I have to do a clean in order to get the thing to regenerate. At least I'm pretty sure that's what's going on right now. There we go. Hi there, Jeff is in Austin. So changes I make in real source code are now in my documentation. So in this case, it's for the benefit of a presentation, but this could be your project documentation. So your project documentation can be pulling stuff out of real source code in your project, which is really valuable. That's just super duper slick stuff. And it does need to be, well, it doesn't need to be unique. What will happen is, so here I've got tag test repeat and end test repeat. I could have those exact same tags someplace else in the same file, so I could have 4 or 5 different instances of those same pairs. And out here in my documentation, where is it? Right here. So this says include the source file from helper taglib.groovy, pull the whole source file in here, and make that part of the documentation. And that's what's creating this right here. That's the whole tag library source file. In the next case, I'm saying include helper taglib spec, and these are the tags that I want to pull in. I want to pull in class begin, test simple tag, and class end. Tag begin is this guy up here at the top, because I want this to be in the documentation. I want you to see the class declaration. This gets pulled in, and then class end gets pulled in, so those closing curly brace. What would happen if I had several of these pairs? So if I had test simple tag, end test simple tag, and end, all of them will be pulled into the documentation. So maybe there are 3 methods in this class that I want to be in the page. I can reuse that same tag over and over again. And Grails is, we're not completely off the farm here talking about unrelated stuff. That's all made possible by ASCII Doctor. It's easy to build ASCII Doctor from Gradle, and Grails 3 uses Gradle for our build system, so we get that kind of capability for free. Grails isn't involved in that at all. So as I said, that's just super duper cool stuff. The whole Groovy user guide, not the Grails user guide, but the Groovy user guide uses that approach. So even if I weren't creating a presentation, if I were just generating project documentation, the ability to pull real code and make that part of my docs is valuable. The docs all the time get out of sync with stuff in the real project, and now the documentation's misleading. That sort of thing is just rockin' cool. And ASCII Doctor is really what's making that possible. But ASCII Doctor is easy to build from Gradle, and Grails takes advantage of Gradle now, so we get that kind of benefit for writing project documentation for Grails app in Grails 3. Super cool stuff. ASCII Doctor is not part of Gradle. ASCII Doctor is its own thing. So there's a thing called ASCII Doc, and ASCII Doctor is kind of a, it's not really a port, but it's another implementation of ASCII Doc, and it has some extensions. And I think the source code stuff that I just described, I think that's part of the ASCII Doctor extension stuff. So ASCII Doctor is its own thing, and there's a plugin for Gradle for building ASCII Doctor. Just ASCII Doctor is, yes. ASCII Doctor is a Ruby implementation of ASCII Doc with some extensions. All right, testing REST APIs. So here I've got a domain class with just a few properties in it: artist name, title, and genre. Here I've got a RESTful controller that, or a music controller that extends RESTful controller, and RESTful controller is a parameterized type, so I'm passing album to the superclass as the superclass parameter there. I'm expressing that the response formats that I want this controller to support are JSON and XML. And so far, it looks like that's all there is to the class. There's actually more in this source code that we don't see here because of the tag stuff that I just described. So that'll appear the next time we see this class in the docs. So I've got a RESTful controller for managing instances of this class, right, the album class. And I want to, I need to create a URL mapping to let the framework know that I want to publish a REST API under /albums and have that be associated with the music controller, right? That's what that URL mapping near the beginning of the file there is. But I want to test that RESTful API. So to do that, I want to use a class called REST Client, and REST Client is provided by the HTTP Builder artifact, and this is not a default dependency in your build.gradle file. So I've added this dependency to my build.gradle file. Again, this documentation came right out of the real build file. There's a whole bunch of other stuff in the build file, but I've got tags just in the stuff that I want to pull into the docs here. So you can see how to express a dependency on that particular artifact. And it just now occurred to me that probably shouldn't be compile, that should be test compile, because I'm only using this for tests. But it'll function like it is, but it's also going to be in my deployed war file, which I probably don't need. Right. So I want to create an integration test. I don't want to write a unit test for that REST API. I want to create an integration test for that REST API. So I'll run grails create integration test, the name of the test I want to create, and you see the path there. I left that in the output on purpose so you could see where your integration tests are created in Grails 3. So under source will be an integration-test folder, and if that doesn't exist, it'll be created right now when you ran this command. Below that will be a Groovy folder, and that's where your integration test will be created. Right? And notice when I created the integration test, I said demo.musicfunctional. The class that's created is musicfunctional_spec. So spec gets appended to the name of to the end of the name. So demo.musicfunctional is what I specified. Demo.musicfunctional_spec is the class that's created there. And here is the start of that test. So this test is annotated with @integration and @stepwise, and I'll come back to both those in just a minute. Inside the test, and notice the test is extending specification again. So this is a Spock spec, but it's an integration test, not a unit test. I've got a property in the test called REST, and it's an instance of REST client, and REST client is the thing that I'm pulling in. That's the reason I needed this dependency, is I want to use REST client, and REST client is part of that library. The property is annotated with @shared, and what that means is if I've got 100 test methods in this class, that's a bad idea. Don't have 100 test methods in a class, but however many test methods I have in this class, they're all going to share the same instance of that REST client thing. I don't need a new one for every test method. So that's what the @shared means there. That's a Spockism again. So here's a test that tests what happens when I send a request to retrieve all of the albums and there are no albums, right? The database is empty. There shouldn't be any albums. So the first assertion there is I expect the response status to be a 200. That's what HTTP status.ok is. I expect the content type to be JSON, and I expect the data to be an empty list because the database is empty, right? Another test that's included is I've got a test that creates a bunch of albums. Notice in the previous test, I'm calling rest.get, and the name of the method I'm invoking there corresponds to the HTTP verb that'll be used. So rest.get will generate a GET request to my REST API. Rest.post will create a POST request to my API. In this case, I need to specify a body for the request, and a way to do that is pass a body attribute to the POST method, and the value of the body attribute should be a map. And in this case, the map has 3 keys in it: artist name, title, and genre. King Crimson is the artist name, Red is the title of the album, and Progressive Rock is the genre. And somehow the REST client class needs to know how to represent that map in the request. Remember, this is a real integration test. Real HTTP requests are being made. This is not a unit test. It's a functional test. So the REST client needs to create a real HTTP request, and we want the body of that request to be some JSON, and we want the data in the JSON to be consistent with this map that's specified there. So I need to specify request content type. to tell the REST client what to turn that map into. So the REST client knows how to turn a map into some JSON and make that the body of the request. So that's what's going on there. Then I want to make an assertion that what I get back is a 201, which is what HTTP status.created is. Making another assertion that the content type is JSON. That's what I expected it to be. And the AND here isn't really necessary and doesn't really do anything for the software. It's only there for the humans. So if you've got a bunch of assertions that you want to make and they have logical groupings, you can use AND to kind of break them up for the people reading the test. So what I'm saying is when I make a request like this, then I expect these things to be true, and I expect these things to be true. So I could delete the and the test is going to behave in exactly the same way. That's there just for us, not for the software. So I make a request to create the red album and assert that that worked. I make another request to create a different album and assert that that worked. And there are 4 of those here. So we just iterate through several post requests to the application. So by the time we get to the bottom of this test, 4 separate albums have been created, right? That's how many are in that code that I just rifled through. The next test, and these tests are in the source file in the order that I'm iterating through them right now. You're only seeing one at a time to keep the code in the slide manageable, but the tests are in the source file in the order that I'm iterating through them. And that relates to the stepwise annotation that's you see at the top of the class. The stepwise annotation causes 2 things to happen when this test is run. One is that the test methods are guaranteed to execute in the order that they're declared in the source file. And that's important in this case because the first test is testing what happens when the database is empty. The second test is creating a bunch of albums. And the third test that we'll step through in a minute is retrieving those albums and asserting that the data that we get back is what we expected. It's important that those tests happen in that order, right? If the last test runs first, it's going to fail. It's important that they get executed in the order that I just described. That's what the stepwise annotation does. And in addition to that, as the framework is iterating through the test and executing them, if one fails, then the test will stop at that point. We won't execute the rest of them because the idea is that since you've annotated this test with stepwise, each test probably depends on the previous tests operating as described. So once one fails, the rest are probably invalid at that point. So stepwise causes the test to be executed in the order that they're declared in the source file and causes that behavior that I just described. As soon as the test fails, the rest of them are not executed. Stepwise is Spock. That's right. That's not a grailsism. That's a Spockism. So what this test method is doing is sending GET requests, again, to /albums. And this is the same URL that the first test was sending requests to. The first test was asserting that we got no data back. And this test is asserting that I get 4 elements back because I've created 4 albums. I expect there to be 4 elements in the JSON, and then here I'm just asserting that the information in the JSON is specifically what I expect it to be. Right? So we've got 2 prog rock albums, a heavy metal album, and a blues album. And there's one more test here, but questions about any of that so far? All right. So let's fill out or add some more code to our music controller. And what this is, what we're doing here is overriding the list all resources method, which is normally inherited from the RESTful controller class. And what the list all resources method is supposed to do is return some albums in this case. And what the default list all resources method does is it returns all the albums. But that's not, in some circumstances, that's not what we want here. I want to be able to pass in a request parameter called genre. And if I do pass in a request parameter called genre, then I want the criteria of this query to be only return the albums whose genre is whatever the genre request parameter value is. So you see an if condition there that says if m.genre. That means if there's a request parameter called genre, then add a criteria to this query that says only return the albums whose genre is the value of that request parameter. Right? So a way to test that is, again, using the REST client. And you see there where footnote 1 is up there in the source code, that's the REST client way of specifying request parameters. So you specify a query attribute, and the value of the query attribute is a map. The keys in the map correspond to request parameter names, and the values represent the values of those request parameters. So that first call to GET is going to send a request to what you see at the bottom there, /albums, ? Genre equals progressive rock. So what I expect to get back is just 2 albums, right? If we went back and looked at the test up above, we would see 2 of them are progressive rock albums. Where you see footnote number 2 there, I'm asking for all the heavy metal albums, and there should only be 1 because that's what was created up above. And then the same thing down here with a blues album. So I've got really a pretty simple and slick way to test a REST API without, there's just not much complexity here, right? I'm just create an instance of this REST client class. The REST client class knows how to create HTTP requests, send them to the app, get the response, and then make whatever's in the response available to the test in a way that's easy to interact with, which is what you see here. All right. Questions about any of the REST client stuff? Or comments? Good stuff. It is great stuff. I like it. So to running tests, a way to run your unit tests is with the grails command. You can run grails test app unit : describes which test you want to run. So grails test app unit : will just run the unit tests. Or more common now in Grails 3 is use Gradle to run the tests. So in this case, I'm running Gradle w space test. That will run all of just the unit tests in your project, not integration tests. If I want to run integration tests, I can do that also with Gradle. Gradle W integration test is the name of the target. And this isn't a Grailsism, this is a Gradleism, but you can abbreviate any Gradle task using camel case. So the task name is integration test with an uppercase T. The first T in test is uppercase. So I can abbreviate that task name with just IT, I uppercase T. So if you're commonly executing Gradle tasks that have long names, that's a convenient little trick. So Gradle WIT will execute the integration tests in the project. And if I want to run all the tests, unit tests and integration tests, and maybe I've got other kinds of tests, check will run is a Gradle task, and it will run all of your tests. So Gradle W check will run the unit tests and run your integration tests. Make sense? Right? That, of course, is new to Grails 3. Now that we're using Gradle, you can't do that with Grails 2. And I think that's it. So thoughts or comments about any of the testing stuff in the framework? Anything at all that I've talked about? I used to have people behind me.
If I want to just test a REST app, say it's not even necessarily a Grails app.
Yep.
I should be able to write my own standalone little project, right? And create these tests and exercise it perfectly.
You could absolutely write a test just like this.
I'm thinking renegade project, right, in a bigger company where it's like, well, you can't program it in Grails, but we'll do tests, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. So you could use this REST client. You can use the REST client in application code. It wouldn't even have to be a test. REST client is just a class that knows how to make an HTTP request. So years ago, say 7, 8 years ago, something like that, the way that a lot of folks got started with Groovy is they wrote their tests in Groovy because it's just a really expressive way to write tests. And maybe you work for an enterprise that wasn't ready to let you introduce this newfangled dynamic language into your production environment, new stuff, maybe it hadn't earned the respect that it has today. A lot of organizations got started with Groovy by writing their tests in Groovy. So not writing the application in Groovy, maybe it's still a Java app or maybe some other language, but they want to write their unit test in Groovy because Groovy is really expressive and does a whole bunch of things that simplifies unit tests. So they do that and they realize, holy cow, this is so much more expressive and more productive and more efficient writing the test in Groovy than if I had to write the corresponding test in Java. So that's great. And then they realize, well, if it's easier to write my test in Groovy, it might also be easier to write my application code in Groovy. And so testing is a way that a lot of folks got started with Groovy in the beginning, especially at enterprises that had concerns about introducing new languages into their production environments. Usually when an enterprise has those kinds of concerns, they have less strict constraints on what you can do in your development environment, right? This code never goes to production. The ops guys don't have to support it. They never even see it. This is just, nobody ever sees this except for the developers and, you know, maybe some people around it. But it doesn't affect your production environment at all, so it's easier to, most organizations have looser restrictions on what technology you can use in your testing environment and your development environment in general. But absolutely, back to the original question, absolutely you could use REST client to test any app, not just a Grails app, and you could use it inside the app. right? Not just tests. Yeah.
I have another question that's not related to something.
Is it related to prog rock?
It's related to grails.
Okay, that's good too.
We were working on an app that uses Spring Boot, Groovy, and all of that.
Yeah.
And we were stuck in a place where we could not mark the GOM anymore for testing. So is there any way we could use Grails, GOM, in Spring Boot app?
Are you using Gorm in the boot app?
For
Yeah.
marking for unit testing.
Well, so that wouldn't even make sense unless you were using Gorm in the real app. So
Yes, we are
okay.
using GOM in the real app.
Okay.
And it's all Grails, GOM, Hibernate, all of that. It all works fine. Integration tests are fine. But integration tests are like time taking. You can't have to do everything.
Yep.
Clean up everything.
Yeah, so this is one of the things you're going to give up if you want to use boot and you want to use Gorm, but you don't want to use Grails. Is you're going to give up. There's a whole bunch of stuff you're going to give up, and this is one. You're not going to have the same kind of testing experience in boot if you're using boot without Grails. So Grails 3 is built on top of boot. So if you were to use Grails 3, you could do everything you can do in boot because boot's there. You can do 100% of what you can do in boot. You can do in Grails 3. And in addition to that, you get a whole bunch of other stuff that Grails has to offer, including the slick mocking support. So I didn't demonstrate this, but I can point it out. In this test, I've annotated the test with that test4 demo controller. And if this test is calling controller actions that interact with the person domain class, and maybe persist instances or send queries to the database, but if the test is executing code that interacts with Gorm, that won't work unless I mock the person class. So what I would do is I would annotate this class with @mock and pass the person class as an argument. And if I need to mock multiple domain classes, then I would annotate the class with @mock and pass a list of classes. So person, comma, widget, comma, address, whatever.
That's exactly what we're trying to do. But do we have to go to Grails 3 to be there, or can we just...
Yeah, I think so. I don't know what it would take to make that work outside of Grails. Certainly it could be done, but yeah, so that's one of the things that Grails will do for you is make that more simple. So if we start making everything possible outside of Grails, then what does that even mean? Yeah. That is true. That's a Grails 2ism.
That's the Grails 2ism,
But they're using Spring Boot.
Spring Boot, you have a Spring Boot app. It has Grails, it has Gorm, it has everything. It's just that you don't have the mixing because the boot initializes separately.
Yep, it's a whole different thing. So the reason she's right that you don't have to use Grails 3 to use @mock. The reason that I made the conversation Grails 3 centric is apparently you want to use Spring Boot. If you use Grails 3, you get to use Spring Boot. In fact, you have to use Spring Boot if you're using Grails 3. There's no such thing as Grails 3 without Spring Boot. So you get to do everything you want to do in boot, and you get a whole bunch of other stuff. This is just one small example. That's a fantastic end of the story, yes. So you decided to move to Grails 3 because boot, you wanted to take advantage of more.
We shut down boot app and we just moved to Grails. That way we have all the testing support because there are a lot of dependencies. We can't really mark.
So you moved to Grails 3?
Not just the Grails.
To Grails 2. Okay. So then whatever it is that you wanted to take advantage of in boot, now you can't take advantage of that, but you can take advantage of all the testing stuff that Grails has to offer. Yep. But move to Grails 3 and you can get the union of all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, basically, I'm a Java programmer, but I have worked on quick build, which they use Groovy a lot.
Did you say quick build?
Yeah, it's a build tool.
Okay, not familiar with that. But.
Yeah, it's a nice build tool, and so I like Groovy very much. But I haven't worked on for testing purposes. So how this is it very like? But I have worked on Java, JUnit, and Mosquito and all. So I find it the same as that. JUnit and Mosquito, when what you're saying, like bend and mocking.
It's just a lot less typing doing this, right?
Is
Way less typing than
Yeah, so I don't see it the same as those things at all. The things that I don't like about those tools are what motivate how some of this stuff works.
There's a lot of convention in Mosquito, which is my opinion, but it's a long way.
I don't own Mosquito.
No, yeah, I don't take any offense to it. If for whatever reason you just enjoy Mockito tests, JUnit Mockito tests better than Spock, then do that, right? In a Grails application, you can just, so your test doesn't have to extend specification. It can extend JUnit's test case or Groovy test case, which extends JUnit 3's test case. So your Grails tests don't have to use Spock. There are good reasons that we chose that as the default, but if there's something that Mockito does better for you, then go to town. You're set up to do that. You don't have to. You won't need any special plugins. You'll have to add a dependency on Mockito, but yeah. But I think if you press into it, you'll see that writing Spock tests for practically every kind of scenario is going to be cleaner, less code, and easier to look at than writing a JUnit test that uses Mockito. What is it?
They're a lot of fun to write.
It really, it sounds like a crazy thing to say, but I agree with you 100%. It kind of is fun, especially while after sort of immediately stepping out of the pool of dealing with that other stuff and realize, holy cow, this can be, this doesn't have to be nearly as tedious as it used to be. But I agree, writing tests with Spock is can be fun.
Yeah, just reading them is so much easier. You don't have to have somebody as technical to write it.
Yeah.
That way, as far as not having somebody as technical to write Spock write those tests, they're easier to follow.
I agree. So it was either, I don't know if it was you guys or the folks I was meeting with Tuesday, but we were talking about this exact test a couple of days ago. I was with someone, and they mentioned that the developers were copying and pasting the where block and sending that to the business dudes, the business people, and the business people can look at that with a little bit of description about what's going on, and they can make sense of it. And they can fill out that table now. So maybe I send them an example that has 3 or 4 rows in it, and there's a whole bunch of scenarios that need to be tested. They can practically author this test, and even if they don't want to get involved in editing the Groovy file, they can just send me some text that represents that table. And remember, the table can have lots of stuff in it. This is a trivial example, but the business folks, with a little bit of instruction to describe what's going on in this table, they can give me a whole bunch more data now, and I can paste it out of an email into here and go to town.
I was able to, in my previous company, I was able to articulate what the test was doing to like the project managers and stuff a lot easier using Spock than I was with anything else, because they could understand it a lot easier than anything.
Yep. So I think a non-developer is not going to look at that and figure out what's going on, but I can sit down with a non-developer in a very, very short amount of time and explain what's going on, and they can move on and contribute to the process from that point on.
These two over here actually are QA engineers at Reachforce. So
the two of you are QA engineers? Yeah. So how do and you're not developers?
No.
Is that true? Not really. So how do you feel about looking at that? You were saying that you.
No, it's very easy to use. I mean, I've used it a little bit in the past, so it's not a big deal, I guess.
Right.
As opposed to like JUnit and stuff like that, it's a lot easier for me to understand, but it's also easier for me to tell a product manager or somebody else or something like that what's going on and like what these tests are going to do.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, I agree. I think Spock specs in general are easy to look at, easy to write, easy to look at, easy to figure out what went wrong when a test does fail. I'll find a good example here. But as I said, I think a Spock spec generally is easy to look at, easy to figure out what went wrong. I enjoy writing Spock specs. They'll help you live long and prosper. That's right. Yeah.
maybe someday they'll get a logo.
They had the Star Trek thing for a while, and I don't know what happened to that. Maybe.
Well, I remember Peter.
Niederweiser?
He was afraid that he would get sued by the studio, right?
Yeah, so I don't know if it went away because
So
he got a phone call.
He basically didn't find anything else that fit the bill, and I don't know whose choice it is.
Just their website. It's just the name Spock.
Yeah, I noticed Rob did for the Google Plus page for our group. He tried to find one, and it was Spock.
Right, so the takeaway is we need to make a logo for them?
Yeah. Someone donate $5 to Fiverr. Maybe we'll get it. I don't know who picks it though, because Peter isn't really involved in it, right? So,
I don't think Peter is still involved.
We didn't talk much about integration testing and like Dev or anything like that, so I don't know. I'm not sure how to wire that into the conversation, but
Yeah, we can you know what I'll do? So what are people, what are general expectations? Is 8 o'clock the pumpkin time generally?
Not really.
Are we over budget, or do we have another 10 minutes?
You can go all night long if you want.
I don't know.
Everyone gets tired, they can go.
I don't know about that. My ride is not going to maybe comply to that. Hang on just a minute here. I won't let this turn into a long-winded thing, but let me show you an example of a JEB test. If I can find one really quickly. All right, here we go. Here's a good example.
Maybe just a little bit of background on what it is. What JEB is.
Yep. So JEB is a so your first pass at it is JEB is a framework for writing functional tests for interacting with a web app. Right? It's a framework for writing tests for interacting with a web app. Let me come back to that. So consider that part one. I'm going to come back to part two after I describe this test, and it'll be easier to talk about part two. So in this test, so I'm not testing a REST API. I'm just testing interacting with a browser, right? So I've got some CRUD capability built into this application, and there's a domain class called person, and persons have first names and last names and ages. Here's a test that if I just step through this, so I'm interested in your input from the two of you when I'm done here. If you can follow along with what's going on here from a non-developer's perspective, I'm sure that you will. So what line 11 there says is send a request to /person/create. And that's going to be a GET request. And a common feature request for JEB is, well, give me a syntax for specifying a POST request. Turns out that's a bad idea. So I'll come back to why that is in just a minute. So when you call go /person/create, that generates a GET request to that URL. And what line 12 is doing is grabbing the form element out of that page. And it turns out this page is only going to have one form, so I know the one I get back is the one that I want. Form.age equals 135, form.firstname equals grandpa, and form.last name equals Brown is filling out a form. So it's filling in some text fields on the form where the text field names are age, first name, and last name. So I'm describing that I want to fill out this form. And then on line 16, I'm clicking the create button. So I visited /person/create, I filled out a form, and I click create. And what I expect to happen is I expect to see an error message that says age 135 is invalid, the maximum allowed age is 120. So the person class has a constraint on it that says the age can't be greater than 120. And this test is asserting that when I try to create a person that I see that error message. But lines 11 through 16 are really the interesting part. So I'm sending a request. Then I've got a little bit of code to get a reference to the form, and then I fill out the form and then click a button. So what I'm really describing here is an interaction with the web app, specifically through the browser. I'm describing how a user interacts with the browser. The user goes to a URL and then fills out a form. So that comes back to, we're going to pop a couple of things off the stack here. One thing I said we'd get back to is the idea that JEB doesn't allow you to specify a POST request or a PUT request or anything other than a GET request. And that makes sense if we think about what JEB really is. And JEB is a framework or a tool for scripting interactions with a browser. If you think about how you interact with a browser, there's nothing you do in a browser that says generate a POST request. What you do is you fill out a form and you click a button. And that's what this allows you to do. And that button happens to generate a POST request, but you don't decide what kind of HTTP verb is going to be used. You're clicking things on the page. And that's what JEB is about. JEB is about allowing you to describe an interaction with the browser. So it doesn't make sense to say generate a POST request. That's not what the framework supports, and it doesn't support that on purpose. So that now we get to pop the next element off the stack, and get back to the beginning. And so I said we'll start with the idea that JEB is really a tool for writing tests for interacting with a web app, but it's really a tool for interacting with a web app. And a test is one way to take advantage of that, and it's the way most people take advantage of it. But if you want to script some interaction with a browser for whatever reason, JEB can be used for that, and people do that. People will use JEB not to write unit tests, but to describe some interactions with a web app for some reason. So maybe they want to write some kind of batch loading of data, and there's no good way to do the batch data. The only way to load this data is through the browser, so they write some JEB scripts, and the JEB scripts describe interactions with the browser. So if for whatever reason you want to script some interactions with a browser, Jab is a fantastic tool for doing that. Turns out the most common use is writing functional tests like this. So what do you think about those 6 or 7 lines right after the when? With just a brief bit of description, you probably can make perfect sense of that. I would imagine.
It makes perfect sense. It's, I think it all comes back to the whole, tagging and making sure that everything in the form is tagged properly, because otherwise it's not going to recognize it, right?
Yeah, so that's a tedious detail here. So form.age equals 135, form.firstname equals grandpa. Those names after the dot correspond to the names of elements in the page, and that's not something you see from the user's perspective.
Especially not in legacy code.
Yeah.
So that's the biggest problem that I've always run into with trying to automate any of this stuff using anything is, making sure things are tagged properly and having a unique name and things like that. And, which, I mean, you're going to run into that with anything. But
That's right.
But no, I mean, yeah, this is a lot easier than a lot of the other options out there, that's for sure.
So if the name of the input fields were A, B, and C, this would say form.A equals 135, form.B equals grandpa. That's just a bad idea, but that's just the way that it is what you're describing here is the name of the field you want to type stuff into. There's no way to express, go find the field that is the first name field based on anything other than the name of the thing, right? So that's a detail. The page has to be authored in a reasonable way, and that's it. So there's probably no really great way to improve on that, but that's a detail that.
That's the only problem I've really run into dealing with anything like this is tagging and naming conventions and everything like that, and having duplicate. Like I've ran into it multiple times where there's been duplicate labels and duplicate tags on the same page, and it just throws all my automation to hell, and it's not fun.
Yep, that can get tedious. So this is the happy path, right? This is a reasonably this is a well-written form, so it's easy to interact with.
It's easy to teach somebody this too. So
it is. Yep, I agree with that. Other comments about Jeb or anything else?
And slightly a question. You showed us as Doctor. What other interesting plugins do you use on a daily basis?
For documentation in particular, or just plugins? So what plugins I use in general is the wide array, just depending on what the application does. So if I need to add role-based authentication to an application, I would use the Spring Security plugin. And if I needed to add scheduling of jobs, like cron jobs, you can think of them, in a web app, I would use the Quartz plugin. There are tons of plugins that have been written for Grails over the years, and they all do different kinds of things. The most commonly used plugins are the two I mentioned are very commonly used. The Hibernate plugin is installed by default, so it's really commonly used. But the vast array of plugins that, I mean, there's like 1,200 plugins that have been written for Grails 2. Those all haven't been ported to Grails 3, but over 1,000 plugins have been written for Grails, and they all do, most of them do different kinds of things, and you use the ones that make sense for your application.
No, all the plugins you just mentioned are well known by the community.
Yep.
Any specific ones?
Nothing specific comes to mind that jumps out. Just depends on what I'm trying to do, right? If I'm building an application that needs to take advantage of, so if I want a CAPTCHA in a form, there are 2 or 3 CAPTCHA plugins. So if I need a CAPTCHA in a form, that comes to, I realize, okay, my application needs a CAPTCHA. CAPTCHA is not part of my IP. CAPTCHA is something that tons of applications use. I'll bet there's a Grails plugin for CAPTCHAs. So I'll go out to the Grails plugin portal and search for CAPTCHA. And let's just conduct an experiment here and see how many there are. But it'll be more than 1 and less than 100.
305.
There's 300. There's not 305.
305 actually in the market.
That sounds about right. Simple CAPTCHA plugin, Grails. So now I've got 6, 1, 2, 3, 4. I've got 6 options. So I can maybe take a glance at the documentation. If the documentation doesn't help me whittle it down, I might look at the source code repository and see one of them was updated in September and one of them was last updated in 2009. So that's another hint I might use. But so if I wanted to add captchas to my application, I would recognize that that's probably something that or I know that that's something that lots of applications need. There's probably a plugin for that. Come on here to the plugin portal. I would find the captcha plugins and then work to whittle down which one probably makes the most sense, and maybe build a simple hello world app with each of them to see what they look like. But yeah, so I don't know if I can come up with some good examples of plugins that you haven't known about that you want to use. Yeah, so just the console plugin is another great plugin. Yeah, so summarize how the console plugin has changed your life and made your teeth whiter and made everything good.
In the dev environment, it pulls up, you can access your host/console. It pulls up a web-based console that interacts directly with the application. You can create GORM objects, expose GORM objects, to really investigate the code.
Oh, okay.
We might get some.
Just do a thing. It's like, do a object on demand.
Exactly. Yeah. So basically, it's a web-based. Yeah, it's a web-based Grails console that's interacting with the running application.
Like integration testing with web.
Yeah.
Go back to the
Fantastic.
The which?
the example you were showing the GitHub.
You can turn it
The get one? This thing?
Yeah.
Yep.
So when you're filling in a form, you have multiple text fields with the same name. Can you just pass it in like a list?
So you can't have multiple text fields with the same name, right? Because when you fill out that form and submit it, what would that mean?
We typically get from the Grails side. Yeah.
Is that so? That's what you're talking about, a form that was specifically designed that way. Yeah. So there's a syntax when you do. How does that work? It might be this.
Okay.
We'd have to test that. There's a syntax for doing that. There's also, I think, if there were multiple forms, we could do something like name is create, and that specifies which forms. So there are syntaxes provided by or supported by Jeb that allows you to be specific about which DOM element you're referring to. So yeah, so there are syntaxes for narrowing in when it's ambiguous like that. In this case, there's only one form. There's only one first name attribute.
But again, have multiple first names. Like I can just say form.first name equals and then pass it in your list.
I don't expect this to work. I don't think you can do this and have that fill out the first one with grandpa and the second one with grandma. Maybe that, I don't know. It could be made to work. I don't think that is supported inside of Jeb. I'd have to look. I think this is more likely to work. It would be easy enough to either, I know you voted down the idea of reading the manual earlier today, so I won't suggest that we read the manual. I would suggest that we create a form with 2 of these and we run the test and see what happens.
Nothing against the manual, I just don't think it's read.
Yeah.
Oh. There might be pictures of a form and pictures of stuff you could look at in the manual. I don't know. Yeah.
So initially, the pain point with migration to 3 was that none of the plugins had been ported over, and they make me stay in my cube programming and working on it. So I don't know, but I have a bunch of the plugins, like the really useful plugins, now are ported.
Yeah, a bunch of the plugins have been ported to Grails 3. So we released Grails 3 on March 31st of this year, and before we released Grails 3, there was a list of plugins that we had prioritized and said, okay, these plugins have to be ported or nobody's going to be able to do anything with the framework. So we ported stuff like the Hibernate plugin, the Cache plugin, the Scaffolding plugin. The Quartz plugin was migrated pretty early. The Mail plugin was migrated pretty early. The really, really most common plugins, most of those were ported before we even released Grails 3. And then shortly thereafter, we just continued porting plugins from that point forward. The big one that was holding a lot of people up was Spring Security Core, so that has been mostly migrated at this point. There's a milestone that's been published. Gaps have been filled since the milestone was published, and we'll probably have a real release of the Grails 3 plugin for Spring Security Core soon.
So what's the deal with the Spring Security Core?
Yeah, the Grails 2 version has been at RC for a long time. But if I go out here,
it's hard for people to call it 1.0, right? If finally someone just drops it and just, okay, it's 1.0.
Yeah, that's a tough thing to do sometimes. But out here on our wiki, we've got a page for Grails 3 priority plugins. What we did was a couple of months ago or something like that, we sent some requests out to the community on our mailing list and through our social media channels and said, which plugins are most important that are keeping you from migrating to Grails 3? And we took the union of all those feedbacks. So we got lots of feedbacks from lots of folks, just members of the, we solicited feedback from just members of the community. We solicited feedback from all the clients we're engaged in. This list represents the union of all the plugins that folks mentioned were important to them that were keeping them from migrating to Grails 3. And you see the status of a bunch of them. So all the yeses in this column mean they've been upgraded now. Some of these will not be migrated. I'm trying to remember if there are any that we actually added to the list that are not going to be migrated. This probably won't be migrated. The ActiveMQ plugin doesn't do anything at all other than add a dependency on the ActiveMQ jar file. So you can have a line in your config file that expresses a dependency on ActiveMQ, or you can have a line in your config file that expresses a dependency on the ActiveMQ plugin. So the plugin doesn't do anything at all in Grails 3 land, especially in Grails 3 land because of the Spring Boot's auto configurer stuff. So that's an example of a plugin that you just won't be ported. There are a bunch of other plugins that won't be ported because they don't make sense. Jasper is probably a good example of a plugin that Gradle has replaced for us. So there's almost certainly a Jasper plugin for Gradle.
Oh, okay.
So you would use that in Grails 3.
We were thinking about actually using that here.
It would surprise me if there's not a Jasper plugin for Gradle.
Okay.
So stuff like CodeNarc and what's another kind of code analysis tool? CodeNarc and FindBug, PMD, those are all examples of plugins that probably won't be ported because there are already Gradle versions of those, and Grails 3 is built with Gradle. So back to the question, these are plugins that we've gotten feedback on that says, hey, we would like these plugins. These are the things that we're using in Grails 2 land, and that helped us prioritize a lot of the work that we've done over the last couple of months.
You've been porting a lot of stuff too. Is that,
yeah, To The New is an organization. There is an organization in India. So there, for a number of years, there was a company called IntelliGrape in India, and they had a whole bunch of engineers that all they did was Grails work for years. They were in business all the way back when we were at G21. So IntelliGrape has been around a long time, and all they did was Grails work, I think. And last year they were acquired or became part of a bigger media company called To The New. And the IntelliGrape guys, it's my understanding, are still operating basically like they were before. They're just part of To The New now. And those guys are actively porting plugins.
I don't know how many they ported, but I've seen it seems like a flurry of things. You reported this, reported that.
There's a guy from To The New who posted a note earlier this week that he was working on the plugin that came up in conversations with you guys. Elasticsearch, that's what it is. So Elasticsearch, he's working on that. So yeah, the guys at To The New, the people at To The New are actively porting plugins, which is great. We've ported the most important ones, and we're just whittling away at that list. But it's not the case that so most applications can move to Grails 3, and plugins are not going to be the obstacle at this point. Yeah.
Not on the plugin. So, because Grails is on Spring Boot, does Grails 3 also have a Spring Batch support other than core?
So you could use the Spring Boot Spring Batch support inside of Grails. Inside of Grails 3, that's right. Anything, all the stuff that's.
Got a big top on that, Spring 1.
Did he?
Yeah.
So that's.
Talk about integrating all that Spring Boot and Spring integration, and they had a pretty good talk of tying them all together in Grails 3, but still using all those cool things.
Without any explicit Grails 3 support, right? So because of Gradle and because of Boot, we get a whole bunch of stuff kind of for free. Could have been. All right. Well, I'm glad you guys came out to hang out and talk tech for a while. Thanks again to you guys for hosting the thing. I really do appreciate it.